My name is Glenn Block. I'm a program manager at Microsoft. I work on the new Azure application platform team. That means I get to sit next to a lot of cool guys right now. I sit right near Phil Hack, Scott Hunter, Damian Edwards. We're all working together on the future platform for Azure. Just to set another disclaimer here, I'm actually not going to show Azure today, but everything that I show you will work in Azure. Web API has been designed to work in WebRoll, to work in Azure, and it works outside of Azure. So everything that I'm showing you, you will be able to take to Azure. Because of a bunch of technical issues and not wanting you guys sitting here trying to get my machine going, I've decided to drop that part of it. But I promise you that everything you see here will work and is designed to work in Azure. Just quick thing about me. I've been at Microsoft for about 6 years. The last year, I've been working on this thing called Web API that we'll be talking about. How many people here are actually developing web APIs within their companies? A fair number of you. And what's the driver for that? Why are you developing web APIs? So reach. It's all about reach today. Exactly. Anybody here building SOAP-based services? Do you do those for reach as well? What's the motivation? Say it again? Get the heavy lifting done. Heavy lifting done? Okay, Brian, you've probably got a thought on that. In the firewall. So I think that's really the key differentiator we're talking about when we speak about web APIs. When we designed, when we use traditional web services, they're really more about this deep integration between systems that have some type of trusted relationship with one another. And it's not free really for everybody. It's usually more part of an implementation detail, but I'm having to traverse network boundaries and things like that. Web APIs are the opposite. Web APIs, when people write SOAP services, I mean, we have this WSDL contract and things like that, and you have to really conform to be able to play in the game, so to speak. Web APIs are all about the opposite. It's all about being very open, being very flexible, supporting lots of different formats because different devices have different needs. I left you in that suspense moment for a second. And today, what we're seeing is that if you're building applications today and you want to connect with your user, you have to be able to reach their device. And they probably have more than one device. How many people here have more than one device? And by device, I don't just mean your computer. Exactly. Everybody here's got a phone, smartphone. Everybody here's got one or more tablet-type devices, like the ones we just passed out during this event. So it's all about the device. And it's really a social thing as well, because I don't carry around my computer with me everywhere. Even if I have a laptop, well, maybe if I have a very small one. But really, it's about I want to be able to get to the information that I want wherever I am. And if you're not willing to meet me, I might not use your application. Whereas in the past, it was like the software vendors dictated, like, here's the software, and if you're lucky, we'll make it available on your platform. Today, it's like, look, if you're not going to reach me, you're out of business, basically. So you've spent the whole week learning a lot about clients, and one specific client, primarily, which is the one that we've been developing. Guess what? Behind every client, there's a server. Maybe not every client, but most clients. That's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk a lot about how you build servers to support many different clients. So we'll still be talking about the client, but our emphasis is more on enabling those clients rather than building those clients. And just as a disclaimer, I pretty much suck at building like UIs and all that stuff anyway, so you really don't want to see me building a client. So everything you see me build is going to be pretty simple on the client side. But the key factor to think about here is this idea of how do we develop applications that will support this breadth of clients. How many people have heard that term REST? Heavily abused term. But when we start to think about supporting multiple clients, REST has a real value proposition for us. Because REST is really about building systems where the clients and the servers can evolve independently. And when you start to get in this new world where you have all these different clients, that really becomes a concern. Because I don't want to be held back and say, I can't upgrade my server without breaking all these clients. And why that's a real problem is if you're something like Twitter, a service like Twitter, you don't even own the client. There's tons of different clients out there, and you want to be able to move forward without breaking them. And so that's really where the REST angle comes in. But just to be brutally honest, you don't have to build things in a RESTful way in order to build web APIs that can reach multiple devices. But REST can help you, but it's not for free. Right? A lot of people talk about REST, and they talk about it as like the next greatest thing. Well, it's not the next greatest thing. It's been around a long time. But what they don't tell you is that, hey, you know what? There's a lot of work to do it right. That's worth it if the benefits outweigh the costs. But don't think that you have to do things RESTfully in order to build web APIs. You do not. And I'm a big fan of REST. So what we're going to talk about is WCF web APIs in Windows Azure. As I mentioned, you won't see Windows Azure, but you'll know that it works in Windows Azure, and we are part of the Azure Application Platform team. So there you go. Web APIs is really about enabling you to build such systems, to build these servers that can talk to many different devices. And today, even if you're familiar with Web API, you're going to see some stuff you have not seen, I guarantee it. And one of the things we're going to focus a lot on, which fits with the theme of this conference, is JavaScript clients. But everything that I'm showing you here is not going to only work for JavaScript clients. And we're going to be talking a lot about JSON. And what's nice about JSON is it's a very compact format for passing data around, works very well for the cloud, and you can use it anywhere. Almost any device that you're going to use today has some type of JSON stack in it. One of the reasons why JSON is so popular is because browsers themselves know how to eval. Whenever a JSON result comes back, I can easily turn it into an object. And that's one of the reasons why it's become so popular. But don't be fooled into thinking that JSON is only about browser clients. It's not. So fitting back with the theme of my talk, as we're going to talk about building these systems using JSON, and we're not going to only limit ourselves to JSON, realize that this will work for any type of client. So let's jump into a demo, assuming I can get this right. That's not working. I am not oh, is it coming? I think we're having a little bit of a technical problem here on the screen resolution. Oh, we're partially there. Can we, okay. So you guys have all, how many of you have seen this contact manager demo that I've done before? We're going to do it again. But it's not going to be exactly the same, I promise. So we talked about JSON and JavaScript. And one of the really interesting things about JavaScript is when I'm building client applications in JavaScript, or even server applications if you're using something like Node.js. How many people here know about Node? Cool technology. You don't need to have a concrete type. And that gives you a lot of flexibility because I can just create an object on the fly, start setting properties, work with it. If the system changes, those clients don't necessarily break. There's new properties that are available. I can access them if I want to, but I don't have a recompilation step. I don't have to redeploy contracts. That's one of the things people like when they compare that, say, to the WSDL world. So in Web API, what we wanted to do was take that experience that you have, that flexibility in JavaScript of being able to just work in a typeless way and bring that to the server. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with our canonical REST application, I'm saying that in a pun, which is going to be a contact management service. Now, if you've watched these demos before, you've always seen me start with models. But today, we're not going to start with any models. We're going to be model-free. So you see there's a bunch of references there that are missing. How do I get those references to be in? One of the things we did at Mix is we released a NuGet package for Web API. How many people use NuGet? If you're not using NuGet, you should start using it. NuGet is just awesome, and I'm going to show you why right now. So I've got a new ASP.NET application. It's pretty empty. It's got some skeletal code here. And I want to start to work with Web API. What do? I use NuGet, like any normal person would do. So I come here, and I have these installed locally on my machine. By the way, I'm not saying you're not normal if you're not using NuGet, but once you start to use NuGet, you will ask yourself, how did I ever develop software without it? Because it really is such a nice, fluid experience. It's about time we've had a package manager in the .NET framework, but it's great that that time has come and we're here. So what you can do is, if you go up to NuGet in a few minutes, you'll be able to get this package called webapi.all. That will bring all the Web API stuff in. You don't have to get, you'll notice there's multiple packages. Web API all, the main difference is it includes some add-ons. It also includes OData inherent support, which we'll see a little bit later. But you can pick and choose the pieces that you want. We have this very cool thing called HTTP Client, which we're going to take a look at. Main point is, once I've done that, I'm done as far as being set up and ready to go. All the references and things have been pulled in. The binaries are set up. I don't have to touch web config. I'm ready to start going. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a service contract attribute. We are still in love with attributes, but we're working to get rid of them. And what I want to do is I want to do that classic example of a read-only web API. And that read-only web API is going to be returning contacts for me. But I don't have a type. So what I'm going to use is a type called JSON object. JSON object is a new type that we ship as part of Web API. This type is also available, these JSON types are also available in the .NET framework. And I'm going to write a get method that's going to retrieve my contacts. And then I'm going to put my web-get attribute. It would be nice if I could get rid of that. Why do I have to put that? It's just like unnecessary. Well, if you get our new preview, you won't have to put it. So what we're doing is we're saying by default for the basic cases where you have no URI template that you need to provide, you don't actually have to put that explicit information in. We'll just take care of it for you. It's just a little thing, but little things matter. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new JSON array which derives from JSON object. Sorry. And then what I'm going to do is create a contact. And I'm also going to make this dynamic. So because I made that dynamic, now I can just start setting properties on this contact. So I can say contact.name equals Glenn, contact.contactID equals 1, and then I can add it. And then I can create another one. Name equals Brian. Contact.contactID equals 2. Actually, I don't need to put the quotes. I can put it as just an int. And now I'm going to return that array. Actually, I think... Say that again? Oh, I didn't add it. Thank you. And actually, I think I just tested this and it worked, so I didn't have to do this JSON object. I think you can just return JSON array directly now. Let's see if that works. Okay. So that's it. So I've just written a simple, very simple operation that's just going to return some contacts, and I didn't have to create a type. I worked with this new JSON value dynamic API, just set the properties that I wanted to set, and I can go. Now I need to return this stuff. So one of the things we heard a lot of feedback about was we had a whole bunch of methods that were shuffled away, that were extension methods, that were difficult to find. So what we did in our latest preview is we made it so that that extension method is living where it should be, so it just shows up when you build a web app. So I can just do map service route. I don't have to go hunting around for what's the using statement that I need to put in to make that extension method come into scope. So I'm going to say map service route, and I'm going to use my contacts API. Oops. And we'll call it contacts. If my machine is behaving, that should be all I have to do. Oh, and it's not. Let's see, why is that? That shouldn't even be there. Where is that guy? Contacts collection. Oh, yeah, these don't need to be here. Small glitch. Of course, this didn't happen in my room, but you'll just have to buy my word for that. Very, very simple, but what you're looking at now is that contact manager front end that is pulling that contact information. And this is a jQuery front end. So if I view source, you'll see that I'm just using jQuery and I'm doing a getJSON call. One of the things we fixed if you work with Web API before is, depending on the version of jQuery that you had, or if you were using another JavaScript framework, if it didn't send the proper accept header, you wouldn't get JSON back. So you had to go and use like the $Ajax method, for example, in some cases, to specify the type. What we've done in Web API is we've figured out there's a header that the XML HTTP request object, which is what all these things rest on, sends. And if we see that header, we automatically just flip on to return JSON. We assume, if you don't provide anything, that, hey, we know what you're trying to do. And that's been a fundamental principle of Web API, which I think differs from the way we've done things in the past, which is let's think about the common paths and make those just work out of the box. And then if you want to tweak stuff, let's also think about making it easy for you to change how things work. But case in point here is just with a little bit of code, I was able to build a simple backend that's serving up data to jQuery. What do you think? Now, if I was to go to that directly, it's going to fail. Well, it's not going to fail, but it's not going to give me what I want. IE is going to ask me, do you want to save this file locally? Why? Because the browser doesn't really understand JSON. jQuery can, but the browser doesn't. But I want to be able to view my stuff outside of the context of jQuery. Install Fiddler. Of course you can install Fiddler, and Fiddler is awesome, and one of our guys wrote it, but we're trying to provide a different way to do things now. Because this is an example of something that we think that because it's so critical, if I want to be able to diagnose my web API, I shouldn't have to install Fiddler. I should be able to just walk up to machines and be able to start issuing requests. Wouldn't that be nice? Not have to install anything? So I'm going to do something a little bit different here, and we're going to get more into this a little bit later. I'm going to create this object called Web API Configuration. I miss ReSharper. This is the next version of Visual Studio, by the way. And I've got this property here called Enable Test Client. I'm going to set that to true. Let's see what that does. So I'm going to run my app again. And now I'm going to go to contacts/test. Oh. Thank you very much. And while we're on that note, so we have the ability, whenever you call this map service route method, thank you, Christian, that you can pass in this configuration object. But one of the things you'll see in Web API Preview 5 that we've added is the ability to set a default configuration object, which will be used by default convention for all your routes. If you want to change it and override, you can. So once I do that, I no longer have to pass my config object over and over and over again when I'm registering my routes. I still can override, though. So it really is convention. It's really a default that you're setting up, and if you want to override it, you can. Let's try that again, hopefully with better success. So here, we've got a web-based test client. And I can click over here and say accept. Let's see what it'll do if I just do accept star. Oh, it gave me back JSON. So because this uses jQuery. So it's using jQuery. This is a jQuery client. And because it's using jQuery, it saw that when I sent that request that it was coming from XHR. So on the server, we automatically then flipped on JSON. By the way, the trick that we're doing there, you can do it too, and I'm going to show you how. We've made Web API really easy on the server to do whatever it is that you want to do, whether it be RESTful or not. So what you can see here is I can see my response, but you haven't seen the half of it. So I get IntelliSense on the headers. Right, so if I want to write like, content type, or e-tag, all these kinds of requests, if match, if none match. So it's going to help me do what I want to do as far as inspecting my own services. I can do whatever I want to do. I can change the accept headers and ask for different types of formats. And then it gives me this history over on the right. And this is live. We'll need your feedback on it. And it's not done. There's more work to be done with it. Like it doesn't have a scroll bar right now. But it's a very, very useful tool. Now, you'll have to think, do you want to enable this outside your firewall? Probably not. But on your staging server, it's great for you to be able to just walk over. Or even if you were working with customers, you could go into that customer's environment and say, OK, let's enable this switch so we can see what's going on. One of the other things it will do is even offer you IntelliSense to help you build up requests. Not only the headers, but even the body. We'll see that shortly. OK, so we've just seen a very simple example of wiring up a contact. Now, I return a collection of contacts. That collection, I just newed up myself. How many people are actually going to do that in a real-world application? New it up themselves? Probably not. So what I really want to do is have some type of repository that I can work with. And because we're all Web API and cloud, NoSQL is an interesting option. How many people here are working with NoSQL databases? So RavenDB is a .NET, I think one of the only NoSQL databases written in .NET. If you're not familiar with NoSQL, NoSQL is a document database. So instead of me writing tables and fields and all this other types of schema, which is useful for reporting type scenarios, I can just take a blob of information and throw it in and pull it back. So aside from the goodies you've seen now, the first difference in this contact manager from the one you'll see if you go into CodePlex right now is it's not going to use an in-memory repository. it's going to use a NoSQL database. It's going to use RavenDB. So I'm going to do a couple of things here. The first thing I'm going to do is, how do I get access to that repository? Well, I already have one. Here it is, RavenDB repository, which I've written just to make you guys happy. And I'm going to take that repository, and I need to get my contacts API to get access to it. So how am I going to do that? Well, I could new up that repository myself, but that's going to be a little bit painful over time to have to like new up all that information, especially if I want testability. So one of the things we heard a lot of feedback about in WCF continually is I want to use my IOC container to be able to create my services so that I can inject stuff in, and if I want to do unit testing, I can push mocks in, etc. So we're going to do that. So my favorite IOC, which I'm never bashful about, is called AutoFac. But you can use any one. We have not taken a dependency on AutoFac or anything like that. So I've now pulled in AutoFac, and I need to register it. So I'm going to go to my global.asax, and just so you don't watch me writing a lot of code, the first thing I'm going to do is initialize my AutoFac container. Now what that basically means, now also I have a contact API, which I'm going to now include. So we have a contact API. And we now have our using AutoFac. So that's a method that will just create for me this IOC container. What an IOC container does, think of it as an Uber factory. It will create things for you, but the beauty of an IOC is the things that it creates can actually have dependencies, and those dependencies will get created by the IOC container as well and pushed in for you. So it means you're not newing up these really complicated object graphs. And for testability, it's really nice because it does a whole bunch of decoupling. So what I mean by that is, here's our current context API, which is not that interesting. Let's go take this one. So we'll wipe this stuff out. Oh. So this is where the IOC is powerful. This is saying that I can't just new up this contacts API, and WCF will blow up currently if it tries to do that. Because why? Because it doesn't have a default constructor. It's requiring this repository for Raven to be injected in. And we've just seen over here how we can initialize the container. So there's just one little puzzle piece missing, which is how do I connect that container to tell WCF to use it. That's how. So the initialized container code, remember, that's not web API. That's just my code that I'm using to set up my IOC. This config object exposes for me a lambda, a delegate, that I can set. And I can use that delegate to say, WCF, when you want to create an instance of a web API, use what I tell you. Don't go and do it yourself. Now, some people don't really like working with lambdas. Anybody here really not like working with lambdas? You guys are awesome. You guys have just validated there's nobody in the world who doesn't like using lambdas. I'm going back charged with my team. But if you don't like the way we present stuff in our API, you can derive from web API config. We'll get into more of why that's interesting in a bit. And you can put your own clothing on top of it that makes it look the way you want it to look for your developers or for yourself. So what I've done here is I've wired up the instance. If everything works good, I should be able to now hit back against my service and have it hit against Raven. But the first thing I got to do is start up Raven. One of the beautiful things about playing with Raven, at least, is that it runs in a self-host environment. So all I do is run this start.command, and Raven kicks off. I don't need that. That means we're not getting internet access, but that's okay. Okay, so Raven is off, churning, doing its thing. And now we want to retrieve our contacts. We should hit our breakpoint. So we've hit our breakpoint, which is a good sign because, look, it means my repository instance is there. So it's not going to blow up, assuming everything else is in good shape. There we go. So I've just taken that really simple example and scaled it up a notch, hooked up RavenDB, which is a NoSQL database, and now I've got my contact manager pulling contacts from that NoSQL DB. We introduced IOC in Preview 4. The question was, is IOC only in Preview 5? We introduced it in Preview 4, but we have refined it. We have a new config model. One of the things you'll see when you look at Web API, just to set expectations for everybody, you'll notice there's this prototypes branch, and there's this NuGet package called enhancements. Why are we doing that? Enhancements really are add-ons. They're things we want to get out there. We want to get feedback. They're usable. We're putting them out there because we want people to use them, but they're not necessarily going to stay the same. And of course, whenever you're developing a project that's out there and the source is available, things may change. You're getting it out there early. Enhancements are even less constrained, right? They could completely go away. There's pretty much no guarantee that they'll be there. We're not putting them, but the only reason we would take them away is if you said, this is just useless. Like, why are you doing this? I'd rather you invest your time to do other stuff. Enhancements gives us a nice, safe way to throw stuff out there, get feedback on it. You can use it, and then, at your own risk. And then if it doesn't work out, we can just pull it out. So IOC is one of those things that when I joined the team, I was probably pretty dogmatic about the need for simplifying the experience of just doing what you just saw. And we started to scope that out in Preview 4, giving some, actually even earlier, illustrations of what that might look like. Now I'm happy to say it's in the box. It's an official part of WCF now that we have good support. Well, you'll tell us whether you think it's good for wiring up an IOC container. Does that look difficult, what we just saw? What was that? Very good question. What types are coming back from the repository? And you don't see me doing anything special with types. Hey, they're returning a JSON array. And this gets to another interesting part of our talk, which is the beauty of JSON is there's lots of services out there that are using JSON. And your web APIs, although they produce things, they're also consumers. They also are going to aggregate and pull down other types of information. For example, I may want to use this NoSQL database, but I don't want to put it outside the firewall. Or maybe it's in the cloud, but I don't want other people hitting it directly. I want them going through me. There may be information there that we use internally as part of our system that we don't want to surface up for anybody to just access. So this model of where I'm a client who hits a web API, and then that web API may go out and do other HTTP calls, is not uncommon. And one of the reasons I chose Raven, actually, is it has a very nice HTTP web, it has a very nice web API. I can do everything I want to in Raven simply by making HTTP calls. The challenge today is there hasn't been a great story in the framework for doing just that. All I want to do is make an HTTP request, but I want to do more than just get a string back and turn it into an object. I may want to work with some headers. Maybe I want to do caching, and I know that that server supports e-tags. So I want to hold on to that e-tag, which I won't find in the body. It's shuttled away in the headers. But back to the JSON value question, well, the other reason I chose RavenDB is it's a document database that's all based on JSON. And so that JSON value object that's coming through is actually starting off being created in my repository that takes the data that comes back from Raven, and then I just pass it on. But that raises the question of how do I get that information in the first place? Because Raven has its own client. And it was funny, if you were watching me on Twitter, I was going back and forth with Oraneni Ayendi and a couple of folks that work on Raven, and they're like, why are you doing your own thing? Why don't you just use our client? I said, because you guys have this beautiful HTTP API, and we're developing a client API, and I want to show that because of the fact that you've just made your service really easily accessible over HTTP, I can plug my client in. I don't have to use your client. I can use my client, which supports JSON value, which is what I'm using on my server. So that brings up the question of clients. How many people here have written things that have to make calls over HTTP? And what do you use commonly? And what do you think about that experience? Cumbersome? What's cumbersome about it? Okay, so cumbersome, usability. So we heard a lot of feedback about one of the big things that's missing from the .NET framework is a good HTTP client. You look in every other stack, PHP, Java, Ruby on Rails, there's nice HTTP clients. We didn't have a good one. So we decided to build one. And it's called HTTP Client. So if we look inside my repository, go under the covers, and disclaimer, some of this may be ugly code, but I do have unit tests, and it is very testable. And I'll explain some of the cool stuff we have in WCF and in the client that makes it testable. So here's my Raven repository. If we look at this, create request here. So one of the things we've done in the new model is we've said that people want to float requests and responses around and they want to be able to test them. They want to be able to write unit tests that create requests without having to actually send stuff across the network. And they want to have nice IntelliSense. This is C#, nice IntelliSense with strong typing for working with headers. If you're doing anything serious with HTTP, that matters a lot. So for example, here you can see that I have this HTTP request message. Think of it as a bag. I'm going to pretend la 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 la. As long as the other screen doesn't go away, we'll be okay. Think of it as a data bag for passing information that is strongly typed. So for example, when I come here to look at the headers, I get a nice list of headers, and they're not all strings, right? If I go to if match, it's asking me for an entity tag header value, which I knew one of those up. It's asking me for the tag or to specify it's weak. It's not just a dictionary of just strings where you have to know how to build those up appropriately. It helps you to work with HTTP. And in Web API, what we've done is we're making these work on the client and on the server. So when you write your Web APIs, you can actually work with these directly on the server. I want to make sure not to delete the wrong thing, which will break my demo. Okay, so I'm newing up an HTTP request message. I'm setting the HTTP method. I'm setting the request URI. You notice I'm not having to do a lot of strings here, except for the places where I should, where I want to actually specify the media type. How many people care about qualifiers in accept headers or actually work with them? So if you do, if you're one of the few, although the web cares a lot about them, by the way. Every time you go and use your browser, qualifiers are coming into play. With this new API here, you can specify that. We have this media type with quality, and I can actually have an overload that just specifies the quality. So this just means I'm not building up strings, q equals 0.1, etc. Okay, so I've got this general purpose method here that's going to create a request, and then it's going to return it. And it's done no networking traffic. I could do this in a unit test. It's very, very nice to use, I think. So I'm creating my request, getting it ready to go. So now when I go to do the find, though, so here's where that request is getting called. One of the things that Raven supports is e-tags. That's another reason I chose to use Raven. E-tags are this really cool mechanism that allows a server to return a header, which is a unique identifier of this snapshot that you're looking at. And it allows clients later on to be able to send a different set of headers, like if modified since, if match, if none match, and ask the server, is this still valid? And if it's valid, it just gets back a not modified response. So what's really nice about that is if I'm building like a mobile client and I want to reduce the cost of my communication, I can use, if it supports e-tags, I can use this if none match thing. It's a very small request, and then the response is very small, and the response tells me either here's the new one with the new e-tag, or just use what's in the cache. And Raven actually supports that. So what's nice about these request objects is I've passed it on, and that allows me to do some interesting things. So once the response comes back, I can check it and see, does it have an e-tag? Now this code looks a little bit ugly here. There's a couple of different ways to write this code. And the reason why I'm having to write this code, because I just sat there and told you about how we have all this strong typing, but why am I now using a string? Well, the HTTP spec today says that e-tags should be quoted, meaning they should actually have quotes in them. It's a non-optional thing. And one thing I found out while playing with the HTTP client, it's like, once you lift things off you open the hood of the car, was that it doesn't return quoted e-tags. It doesn't accept quoted e-tags. So I wasn't blocked from falling down to get the raw one, so you can do that. But I had to fall down to the raw headers to get because the entity header value component that we have, the class, requires those quoted strings to be there. Since I went through this, we're thinking about relaxing those restrictions if it's common that people are doing that, and we certainly appreciate your feedback on that. So the key thing here, too, was I wasn't blocked. I had to do a little bit more work because that system wasn't sticking very strictly to the spec. And that's another thing to point out, is that these APIs are highly opinionated around HTTP. One of the guys who designed them actually helped write the HTTP spec. So my architect on my team, Henrik, who was one of the key people who drove this API, co-authored the HTTP spec with Roy Fielding. So he knows what he's talking about. So it's opinionated for a reason. I didn't say REST, I said HTTP. You can also notice that I'm adding an if-match header on the request. I'm tacking onto the request and saying, if I previously received this and got an e-tag, let's tack that on. The niceness you're seeing here about those HTTP request messages is the fact that I could just create it in one place, flow it through, and other things can tack on it. So you get a composition model for working with it, which you don't have a nice story for today. So let's actually see that work and see it add those headers and see what happens here. So what the server should do is return to me a not modified if I send it that e-tag, because it says, hey, I've already got that. So we run our sample again. If I go to context, hold on a minute. Let me try context/1. I'm in the find method, right? Yeah, I'm finding a specific document. So we'll go to context/1. Hold on, did I enable that? Let me double check. Ah, right. That's what I said, did I enable it? Thanks. Okay, that works. So actually, let's use our test client. So what do we see now? I got the ID. It picked up the fact that I have this other resource available. It's not picking up contacts, which is a little disconcerting, but we'll look into that one. And when I select the ID, it automatically highlights it for me as well. So we'll put 1, we'll click send. Yes? Yes. Once you enable the test client, Oh, that's right. That's why it's not showing it. Right now, it doesn't have the full directory of everything, so there is no bug. Sorry, test tools team. It's because I went to contact, and contact is a separate resource from contacts. But one of the things we enable you to do in Web API is to nest resources, meaning you could have different, within a single resource, you could have URI templates that gives you like contact and contact/connections. Those will show up. So everything that's defined on the same API will show up in the tool. Thank you for that. So let's try it again. So I did the first one, and it shouldn't have been cached, because when it pulled the full collection, that was a different call to the NoSQL database than the individual contact. But this time, okay. Why did that not go? Should have hit it. Let's see. Let's try that again. Status code equals OK. All right, well, something must have broke there sending the e-tag over. It saved it. Anyway, something with my code. But the point is, when you want to do this kind of thing, so something didn't get sent over right because the server's not returning not modified, and it should. I'll show you an example with not modified working, though. But anyway, the point here is I'm able to work with HTTP in a nice way, create requests that consume things. Now, the question was around how do I get it back? Like, what do I do with the response when I get it back? So the response also has strongly typed properties, and one of the things it carries on it is a content object, which is of type HTTP content. Now, it's a little bit more typing to do this, dot this, dot this, but the reason for it is all these headers that are here actually relate to the headers that are specific to content. So if I change the content, those headers that all actually relate to one another go with it. But to get the object now off of the content, I can just call this readAs method and say readAs JSON value. And readAs JSON value will take the JSON that I got back, because Raven doesn't know anything about JSON value. It just knows to give me JSON. And it will turn that into a JSON value object that I can then just float through my system, which is what you see going out the other way. Make sense? Any questions on what you've seen so far? Any. Yeah, it's a delegate. So I made that point. The question is, can I hook up any IOC container? And the answer is yes. As a matter of fact, it doesn't have to really even be an IOC container. It's really just a factory, which is a delegate. Let's try this. You can see that it's a delegate that takes a bunch of different parameters. So you're passing the type, you're passing in an instance context, and then an instance and I think there's one other thing that gets passed, like the endpoint. We pass some information because depending on what you're doing with Web API, you might want to access more, but it's not in your face. It's like you don't have to use it. This is the really simple case here, where I just delegate on and pass the type on. Also for parity, some people want to have control of releasing. I can actually set a release instance. I didn't do that here because I'm relying on my IOC container to do it. But if I want to do something special, logging or disposability or whatever it is, I can do it. Yes. I have a bunch. They're not compiling right now. Let me show you why the repository is mockable. One of the things that we did with HTTP client, I'll show you tests that won't run right now. But if you notice, this Raven repository takes in this thing called a delegating handler. So what we want you to be able to do on the client and the server is intercept traffic. And it's great for the testability case, because I want to see, is the if none match header getting added, but I don't want the actual message to have to go across. So with a delegating handler, you can get right in the middle of the request when it happens and just trap it and save that information for a unit test. And because the HTTP responses are so nice, I can just new them up and return one. Now again, this code's not going to compile because I did a whole bunch of changes, but I will show you what the code looks like, and I will make it available in runnable form afterwards. But I have specific tests that do that. So I have this mock RavenDB repository. First I'll show you that. And that implements iRavenDB repository, and it's just a dumb mock. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't use HTTP client, doesn't use anything like that. But I'm not going to use that in this case. I want to use the real repository. What I just don't want to do is have to have the network traffic. So for that, I have these recent views was this other thing I was building, but it doesn't matter. No, that's not it. That's not what I want. I want the DB repository tests. So, where are the Raven? Ah, here we go. So let's see what I'm doing here. So in this one, you'll notice that I'm newing up a RavenDB repository, but I also have this mock handler here. We'll look at what the mock handler code looks like in a second. And so one of the tests I want to do is saying, when retrieving collection and e-tag is stored, then if match header is sent. So this mock handler allows me to fake the response so that when the client is called, it will give back automatically the response that I've told it, which is a full HTTP response. I can set the status code, I can set the payload, everything else. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying, okay, because I'm doing a test that is really just needs a response to come back, I'm going to give it the not modified response, which is what the server should send if the e-tag hasn't changed. And then I'm just going to new up my repository, passing in the handler. So if we go back to the repo code, you'll notice that in the repo, if you don't pass in the handler, I'm wiring up this HTTP client handler. That's necessary because in order to do mutable operations on Raven, it has to have some levels of authentication, like it'll use NTLM and things like that. This is how you do this in the new model. You new up this HTTP client handler, and you can set use default credentials, and it will automatically flow the security context through, which is nice. But what I do is if you pass me a handler, then I'm chaining them. So this is what we call a Russian doll model. And so what that means is that when the request fires, it will hit any handlers that were plugged in addition to the other ones that get wired up. And any one of those handlers can either modify the request, capture it, stop it, and you can do it on the request or the response side. And just to show that last thing, let me show you the fake, the handler. Where is the mock handler? Here it is. And you'll see how easy it was to write it. So just to show you. And yes, I think that's easy. I could have used RhinoMox if I wanted to use it. I chose not to because it was just very easy for me to do what I wanted to do. Rhino is also by the same guy who wrote Raven. So hopefully he's happy that I'm showing Raven. He'll have to forgive me for not showing RhinoMox. All I had to do here was override a send method. And we also have send async because this API supports the new task of T. And if you go on Codeplex, you'll notice in Preview 5, we have a sample using tasks actually in your API. So one of the things that we allow in .NET 4.5 that we're introducing in this release for 4.0, though it's in enhancements, this is one that likely will not go away, is that you can actually support task of T on your operations so you can use our new async model. Okay, so what we see here is that when the request comes in, I'm checking the response object. I'm shuttling away the last request and saving it, and I'm checking the response object to see if in a unit test or something like that it was overwritten. If the response object was overwritten, I'm just going to return it. That's going to stop that request from going any further out to the network. If, however, nobody's set that response, then I'm assuming that for that unit test, I want it to continue on, but still trap the last request so I can check it. Does that make sense? How does that feel from a testability standpoint? Intuitive? Okay. So we're running out of time, and I got a ton more to show. So let's move fast. We've only shown a read-only client, but we've shown a bunch of other stuff. Why is this thing does not like me? I'm getting ready to open my deck on my machine because this is not working well. Okay. So basically what we've shown is, A, we have Web API NuGet packages. Use the WebGet attribute to define your URI template. You don't have to use it if you don't need it. You can use JSON value and JSON array so that you don't have to use real types. And again, we're talking about JSON, so we know that any device, most devices out there today are consuming JSON. So if I build something using JSON as my payload, it's going to be very easy for any client really to consume it. We saw the HTTP client that we can use for consuming other APIs, which will be very common as we go forward and build out our APIs. And we saw how to use the test client to develop and to test our APIs interactively. We also saw how to manipulate HTTP responses and requests. But one of the things we're allowing you to do is to do that on the server as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my contact API. And my contact API currently has a, sorry, I'm going to go to my contacts API. My contacts API thing is like locked up. Yeah, I tried that. It's D, right? Oh. Okay. So now I understand what's happening. All right. I've been hitting the wrong button. Great. So what I want to do is change this a little bit and make it so that I can actually submit contacts, because it won't be interesting if I can't do that. So I'm going to go into my contacts API and paste another method. Now, one of the things about post is that the HTTP spec tells me that whenever I do a post, I should set a location header if I'm creating another resource. So I need a way to return a payload. I like JSON value because it's easy to work with, but I'd also like to muck with status codes and headers and things like that. So instead of, in this case, returning JSON value for the single thing that was created, I'm now going to return HTTP response message of JSON value. And what that's going to allow me to do is to still return a payload, but tweak it. And in this case, I'm going to tweak it so that it sets the location header and sets the status code to created, which is a 201. Now, in order to be able to accept this, my browser, because it's using jQuery, is going to use form URL encoding. We've showed this before, but Web API, this right now is in the enhancements package, supports the ability to do form URL encoding so that I can do these posts. Put Brian's name, click Add, and you can see that Brian got added. Let's bring up the IE toolbar here, start capturing. Let's go add Christian. Click Add. You can see I got a 201 response here. You saw the status code said 201. If we look at the response headers, you can see I got the location header. So that's what HTTP response message of T allows you to do. And we also have HTTP request message of T. So if I want to inspect headers within my operation, work with them, pull out URI, pull whatever I want, I can do that. Okay, that's interesting. But for some kind of cases, I don't want to write that code within. But it's nice to know you have the flexibility to do that. And an example of that is e-tags. I talked a lot about e-tags. Well, what if I want my server to actually support e-tags? So what I'm going to do now is I have these things called message handlers in Web API. And what message handlers do is in the same way as we showed that mock handler on the client so I could get in the middle of the request and do what I want, I can do the same thing on the request or the response on the server side. To do that requires me to do a bit of configuration. So let's jump over quickly to our config slide. We're probably going to go, we're over. We're going to go 2 more minutes. I'm not having good luck with this thing. Okay, there we go. So you can do a lot with our new configuration object. It's not only about enabling IOC. And one of the things you can do is you can enable those handlers that I talked about to plug those in on the server. So I'm going to go back. This is not working well. Okay. So what I'm going to do is jump into my text file here. Oh, it switched again. Not having a good day here. Is it 4? Let's see if this works. Okay. I'm going to copy this into my global.asax in my initialize method. I'm going to add a bunch of different things here that I'm going to register. And one of the things you'll notice that I'm registering is an e-tag message handler. So I'm going to register on the server something that understands how to deal with e-tags. Now I need to wire that up as well. So in the same way as I can wire up the factory for creating the instances, I can also wire up a message handler factory. And I can still use my IOC to now resolve those handlers from the IOC container. And one of the reasons I might want to do that is because some of my handlers actually have dependencies. For example, here I have a URI format extension message handler that requires a set of mappings to be passed into it. The point is, you can use IOC in much more than just for creating the instances. We give you the opportunity now to plug in pretty much wherever you want to use your IOC container if that's what you're choosing to do. So I'm going to run that. And let's go to our test client again. So we'll get contact/1. And you can see that it returned me an e-tag. So I was now able to plug in my own functionality to provide those e-tags, but then I could go back and fetch again. I could copy that quoted e-tag in, and I can come back and use, well, why is the IntelliSense stopped? Interesting. That shouldn't happen. That must be a bug. I can take that header and send it. That should have given me IntelliSense, but it didn't. Sorry, it should be if none match. You see I get a not modified response. So my e-tag handler allowed me to plug in to handle both of those cases. Okay, in 1 minute I'm going to show you last very cool features because we didn't get to as much as I wanted to. OData. Somebody asked about OData. One of the things we're doing in Web API in Preview 5 is we're plugging in support for OData out of the box. What that means is anything can be returned as OData. So we're going to run a different version of the contact manager. This one that doesn't actually work with JSON value. It's using types. It's the old one that you've seen. Doesn't use Raven either. And we're going to run it. And so we've now baked iQueryable into the box as well, if you've heard of iQueryable, which is the OData URI format. So we support the OData URI format, and we support the OData representation format, which are two different things. So the OData URI format allows me to do something like this. And you can see now that what I got back was my contacts. But notice I also got it back in OData. So we now have a generic OData media type formatter that you can plug in if you want to support OData. And it supports OData for XML, and it supports OData for JSON as well. Now here what I've done is I still want to support other types of formats. So like one of the things you can do is I have a vCard formatter, which you've probably seen before. And the vCard formatter, actually let's use our test client. That's a great use of our test client. So we'll go to contact/test. Oops. Let's see, why did that happen? And now we will go to our contacts, and I will say WCF. And we'll use a filter of top equals 2. That didn't work. But what will work is if I put, oh, it's because the accept header, I think, overrode it. So we'll put application/JSON. All right. That means I've done enough demoing. Main point is we've got OData in the box. We've got iQueryable in the box. So where can you get all of this? If you go up to CodePlex right now, you should be able to see that. Let's skip over this. We covered most of this. We have new NuGet packages that we're releasing. And there's a bit of a breaking change here, but we've made it so the old packages will update to the new ones. So if you were using the old ones, the main thing is we have this webapi.core, which we decided to kill. But you'll be able to just get Web API all if you want everything. You can also use JSON value by itself. You don't have to be using Web API to use JSON value or to use HTTP client. You'll also find HTTP client in .NET 4.5, but we've added a few goodies on top. And we have our CodePlex site, wcf.codeplex.com, which we've been pushing source out to. And I'm happy to announce that we've now gotten ourselves into a situation where we'll be doing much more frequent releases. If you go look on the CodePlex change lists, you'll see that I'm telling the truth. We've been pushing out there now much more continually, and we're planning to have continual releases from this point forward. One thing I want to mention on the roadmap, which we didn't get to talk about, is we're working very heavily now with the ASP.NET team. As a matter of fact, we're working very, very heavily together to see how we can make the story for using web APIs with MVC much better. One of the things you'll notice in Preview 4, which a lot of people asked for, we've introduced a new route when you use our Web API configuration class that will play better with MVC routes. So in the past, if you put Web API routes next to MVC routes, there's a problem. If you use action links where the links don't get generated properly, that has actually been fixed. I want to thank you guys all for your patience with my switching machine blunders to machine. That machine is the one we always have whenever we present. That's what threw me off. If you have any questions, I'll hang around. You can always email me at gblock@microsoft.com. You're going to see a lot of stuff start to show up on our CodePlex site. The first thing you're going to see is new quick starts. We have 3 new quick starts. We're updating our old ones and adding a new one. And we'll walk you through a lot of this stuff that I just showed you. And you're going to see a lot more content going forward. And as I mentioned, remember, all of this stuff works in Azure, works in WebRoll, and we're continuing to also look at improving our story in Azure, looking at manageability and other types of things. Thank you guys very, very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference.